There's surprisingly a lot to talk about with Rise of the Triad, a 90s first-person shooter that used the Wolfenstein engine when Doom 2 was on its way. Instead of featuring cutting-edge technology like the games id Software were making, ROT focused on personality and owning all of the contrivances of being a video game. Released by Apogee, Rise of the Triad was originally intended to be a Wolfenstein sequel, but that idea was abandoned, and that's probably for the better. The version of ROT that was released is ridiculous, and while in my opinion the overall gameplay doesn't hold up as well as Doom, Rise of the Triad is still an interesting game to discuss. Tom Hall was one of the key people that worked on the game after he left id Software, and the development team for ROT was known as the Developers of Incredible Power, which is just awesome. You can even find collectible balls in the game with the letters D, I, and P. Why? There's no particular reason to find them, but it's just cool. That's basically what Rise of the Triad is in a nutshell. Let's make a boss and base it off a Red Dwarf character. Why? Because why not? Like I said before, Rise of the Triad came out around the same time as Doom 2, and while it's nowhere as good in terms of overall gameplay, ROT has a lot of personality. Rise of the Triad even does some things that Doom lacks, like you can actually fly in the game with the Mercury power-up. There's also more armor variants than Doom. Like, of course you have the bulletproof vest that absorbs normal bullet damage, however you eventually can pick up a gas mask as well as a fireproof vest, which according to the manual is made up of asbestos and other itchy fire retardants.
You are retarded?
Yes. And now...
Physical or mental?
Rise of the Triad features way more environmental hazards, like fire holes, spikes, crusher blocks, and fireballs. This keeps the level design interesting to a point, but I do think that Rise of the Triad has way too many levels. Some of these maps kinda blend together, and it's the same issue I have with Wolfenstein 3D. ROT's level design is also similar to Wolfenstein, most likely because they share the same engine. Rise of the Triad has a metric fuckton of push walls. The levels are basically giant mazes and are oftentimes annoying to navigate. I think that Rise of the Triad isn't a bad game, but it's also not this gem of 90s FPS gaming either. Rise of the Triad is decent, but frustrating, and the main reason why people remember it is because of its personality. The story is just there to get the ball rolling, and I don't pay it any mind when I actually start shooting shit. The hunt, sorry, I'm Australian, so saying that word is kind of like a tick for me. But anyway, the hunt are on some island and they are investigating some cult, blah blah blah, they have to kill them all. That's all of the information you need to know. Speaking of killing, Rise of the Triad shooting mechanics are rather simple. You start off with a pistol and later on you get another one to dual wield with. This is a cool feature, and it wasn't common to see dual-wielding weapons in FPS games. The pistols are still lame though, compared to the machine gun you pick up, and this basically becomes your workhorse weapon for the rest of the game. The player can hold one explosive weapon at a time as well, but I usually saved the ammo for tougher enemies. The bazooka is pretty self-explanatory, it just shoots one missile at a time. The heat seeker holds less missiles than the bazooka, but it fires a heat-seeking missile which can be useful, I guess. The drunk missile is pretty nuts, as it has the ability to shoot 5 missiles at the same time in all different directions. The Flame Wall and Firebomb are the nukes, and they should be used at select times. If you want to take out a huge swarm of enemies, use these two weapons. The Dark Staff and the Excalibats are the only magic weapons in the game, and I didn't really like the Excalibat much. Considering the enemies you'll be up against when you pick up the bats, it's too much of a short-range weapon to use effectively on them. The Staff, on the other hand, is pretty damn good, and I found myself using this in episode 4 a ton. I like the idea of having a selection of special weapons, but it also means that you'll be using the machine gun for most of the game. This gets very tedious after a while, and the machine gun doesn't feel that powerful. It feels like you're only tapping the enemies with your bullets, and the gun sound effects aren't punchy. At least the explosive weapons are impactful and they create ludicrous gibs. Yeah, ludicrous. Rise of the Triad embraces being silly, where you can fire a missile at a bowl of food to make it hot so it gives you more health, where you have to avoid dangerous robots because they can't be killed, where you can find Scott's head in a secret area of the game, etc. Rise of the Triad was a labour of love, and while I think that Doom outclasses it, the game still has a certain charm to it. Before we move on to the levels themselves, I would get executed if I didn't talk about the game's music. Now, I have a tendency of not mentioning sound or music in my videos, and that's because I don't have a lot to say besides, oh, the soundtrack is mad. However, I've heard that not saying that Rise of the Triad's music is great is punishable by death in 8 countries. So, allow me to say, Rise of the Triad's music is great. With that said, the first level of Rots introduces you to some basic traps and enemies, and it also teaches you how platforming works in this game, with the bounce pads and white plates. You can pick up the God Mode power-up early on in the level, and holy shit, this is one of the best things ever. I love how the player makes yawning sounds when you have God Mode activated, almost as if he doesn't give a shit about killing all of these guards. Alongside God Mode, there's naturally Dog Mode as well. This is just fucking great. What can I say apart from that? There are some power downs in this game to balance things out, which can be a pain in the ass to deal with, but most of the time they are easily avoidable. The mushroom mode makes the screen bob around and all of the enemies and objects will start flashing colours. Elasto mode is another power down, and it can be your worst nightmare when a lot of traps or enemies are on screen. When activated, Elasto mode makes the player bounce around the place, and it can be really disorientating. The first few levels in episode 1 are pretty standard and aren't that difficult. That being said, the challenge factor increases in the later episodes, and this game becomes really fucking irritating by the end. The more interesting levels are also tucked away in episodes 2, 3, and 4. One of the notable levels of episode 1 though is Spring Surprise, as there is a white fog that washes the map out. I don't know why they designed it like this, maybe it was to simulate daylight, but it's one of the more visually interesting levels of the first episode.
Drop it!
Moving on to episode 2, where you are inside the monastery. The room is probably the most unique level of the set, since there are almost no enemies in the map, and the level relies on platforming puzzles and traps only. It's a cool palette cleanser, especially because episode 2 introduces the Triad Enforcers. Now these guys are complete bullet sponges, and while they aren't as dangerous as the wizard fucks from episode 4, they show up so often throughout the campaign, and the game starts to sag as a result. To be fair, you can blow them up with your explosive weapons rather easily, but you want to save that ammo type for difficult sections, and after a while, it gets pretty boring peppering the Triad enforcers with your machine gun. Let's talk about the other enemies that Rise of the Triad has to offer. There's guards, and more guards. These fuckers make up 90% of a roster, but each of them have different properties that make them unique. The low guard shoots you with a basic pistol, and they aren't that much of a threat. The high guard uses a machine gun instead, and if you're lucky, you can grab the gun off of his corpse. If you're just starting out and don't know where the machine gun is, you being able to get it from the high guard is very useful. The over patrol guard is dressed up in all black.
I'ma have your family dressed in all black.
While they only have a pistol, they can also trap you with a net. You can either wiggle out of it, which will take a few seconds as the enemies chip away at your health, or you can use a knife to cut free. The lightning guards are basically the same as the low guards, but they can steal your weapons. Usually they do a pretty shitty job at doing this, as you can mow them down very easily, but I do like this enemy quirk. All of these different properties almost make up for how many officer enemies there are in the game. Last but not least, for the guard enemies, we have the strike team. They have the ability to roll out of the way of a player's fire, and they have extra maneuvers compared to the regular enemies. Good stuff. Back to episode 2, the first downright bad level of Rise of the Triad is Rocky Plateau. It's way too big for its own good, and while I know what they were trying to do with the whole open world idea, it just doesn't work. It's too tedious going from one area to another, and figuring out where everything is starts to become a nightmare. Elevator trouble can also fuck off, but the rest of episode 2 is pretty sound, although a tad bit forgettable. Episode 3 features two types of robot enemies. The normal patrol robots can be blown up with missiles, but the ballista craft can't be fucking killed at all. Luckily they don't show up too much in the game, but god, it's infuriating to have an enemy that you know you can't do any damage to. The episode itself is long but playable, and I don't hate it except for the hard as fuck boss fight at the end. NME, that fucking prick, shoots out homing missiles and has other patrol robots to assist. What a pain in the arse. Fuck this boss fight. I'm done. I'm fucking done. Fuck this. Okay, after some patience and a lot of quick saving, I managed to get to episode 4. This is probably the worst episode of the bunch, due to the bullet sponge wizard enemies. The Death Monks are just fucking tedious. All they do is walk forward and try to attack you from a very close range. They aren't challenging to deal with at all, and instead you are just bored because they take forever to kill. The Deathfire Monks are the projectile-based wizard enemies, and these guys are an actual threat. It still takes way too long to kill them, but at least there's a sense of danger there. Rise of the Triad becomes a slog from episode 3 onwards, and it might turn some players off. Along the way, you encounter El Oscuro. However, in his human form, you don't even have to shoot at him, he just tires out. This is a weird idea for a boss in my opinion, and it reminds me of that Watch Me Dance boss from Monster Party on NES. But yeah, just ignore all of the special weapons lying about and just dodge his attacks until he's drained. He transforms into his true form, a snake-like figure, and from there you have to chase him around the map. Into the Dark Nest is the final level of the game, and before you finish the boss off, you need to destroy his eggs. There are some eggs tucked away in a rather hidden spot, and if you don't destroy them, a false ending will play where the earth gets destroyed. This boss is decent, and apart from the hidden eggs, it's way easier than Enemy for example. So that's it for Rise of the Triad, and while there is some fun to be had with the game, it doesn't hold up in the same way that Doom does. To be fair, that might have something to do with the lack of good source ports for the game and how it was working with an outdated Wolfenstein engine. However, I also do feel like the level design gets stale after a while and the gunplay isn't great enough to make up for that. I know there are die-hard fans of this game, and yeah, I'm a fan of it too, I generally enjoy it, but it's not in the upper echelon of 90s FPS gaming for me. What makes Rise of the Triad stand out though is the personality that's packed into it. As I've said countless times, Rise of the Triad is a game that has so much potential, and maybe if they developed a remake or something, oh wait, they did.